Story 1. Elliot, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm 28 years old and I work as a land surveyor based out of Albuquerque. I travel for work pretty regularly, and about 2 years ago I started taking the Southwest Chief. That's the Amtrak line that runs from Chicago through Kansas City and Albuquerque all the way down to Los Angeles for longer hauls instead of flying, because I hate airports and I actually like the desert landscape from a train window. It's meditative in a way that flying never is. You're close to the ground. You can see the actual country you're moving through. It slows everything down in a way I appreciated. That appreciation has limits now, and those limits were set on a night in October on a westbound Chief between Albuquerque and Gallup. I was heading to a job site near Flagstaff, which meant I needed to get to Gallup and be picked up by a colleague. It's about 2 hours between the two stations, mostly high desert, mostly dark after sundown, a stretch of New Mexico that has a particular quality of emptiness that is beautiful in daylight and something else entirely after midnight. I boarded in Albuquerque just after 11 at night. The car was sparse. I counted 9 other passengers when I boarded and found a seat on the left side where I could put my bag on the window seat and take the aisle. I want to describe my car specifically because the layout matters. The Southwest Chief coaches have 2 seats on each side of the aisle, and the seats recline significantly. There are overhead racks and reading lights above each seat. The car has doors at both ends connecting to adjacent cars, and the bathroom is at the rear. The lighting at night is dim overall, with individual reading lights the main source of illumination if you want to see anything clearly. About 40 minutes out of Albuquerque, somewhere in the dark stretch before Grants, I woke from a light doze to find that the car had emptied considerably. I could see 3 other passengers from where I was sitting. A man sleeping 2 rows ahead, a woman with headphones 4 rows back, and at the very rear of the car near the bathroom, another figure I couldn't make out clearly in the dim light. What woke me up, I realized after a moment, was a smell, faint but specific. The kind of chemical, slightly sweet smell that I associate with industrial solvents, something I come across occasionally in my work. It was not a smell that belonged on a passenger train. I sat up and looked around and tried to identify where it was coming from. The figure at the rear of the car was closer than I initially registered. When I looked directly toward the back, I realized the person wasn't sitting in a seat. They were standing in the aisle near the rear door, in the dim space between the last row of seats and the bathroom corridor, standing still, facing my direction. I couldn't make out features from that distance in the low light. What I could make out was the posture. Not the posture of someone standing in an aisle waiting for the bathroom. Not the posture of someone stretching after a long sit. This was a rooted, deliberate stillness. Weight evenly distributed, no fidgeting, no phone in hand, no glancing around. Just standing and facing forward. Facing my direction. I watched for a moment and then turned around and checked the car ahead through the connecting door window. The car ahead was better lit, and I could see passengers moving and sitting normally. I turned back. The figure had moved closer, not dramatically, maybe 2 rows closer, still standing in the aisle, still facing my direction. I had not heard any footsteps over the noise of the train, and I had only looked away for 15 seconds. The chemical smell was stronger. I am not someone who panics, and I want to be clear about what I did next. I did not catastrophize. I took stock. I was on a moving train in the New Mexico desert, 2 hours from either major station. The man 2 rows ahead of me was still asleep. The woman with headphones was still in her seat. The figure was now approximately halfway down the car and standing still again. I stood up. The moment I stood up, the figure turned and walked to the rear door of the car and pushed through it into the connector between cars, moving at a pace that was neither running nor casual. Just gone. The rear door swung shut behind whoever it was. I walked to the front of the car and went through into the next car forward, where I found the conductor making his way through. I told him there was someone in the car behind me who had been standing in the aisle and that there was a chemical smell I couldn't identify. I described the situation as clearly as I could. He took it seriously. I'll give him credit for that. He radioed someone and then we walked back through my car together. The rear of the car was empty. The smell was still present but fainter, and the conductor noticed it too because I saw him react to it without saying anything. He went through the rear door to check the connector and the car behind it. He came back about 3 minutes later and told me the cars behind mine were empty and locked, that this was the last active passenger car on the train that night, and that beyond the rear door was just equipment cars that were not accessible from the passenger section. The rear door that the figure had walked through opened onto cars that passengers could not access. The conductor did not have a good explanation for that. He moved me to the car ahead and sat with me until we reached Gallup, talking about nothing in particular, which I think was his way of making sure I wasn't alone without saying that out loud. I was picked up in Gallup at 1:15 in the morning by my colleague. I told him what had happened on the drive to Flagstaff. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me what the figure had been doing near the bathroom at the rear of the car. I told him I didn't know, just standing. He said, just waiting to see if anyone came back there. I have thought about that framing every single time I've been on a train since. What it would mean for someone to position themselves at the back of a nearly empty car in the dark and wait. What they would have done if someone had come. Story 2, Simone, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I need you to understand something before I tell this story. I'm a 44-year-old woman who raised 2 kids by myself in Harrisburg after my divorce, and I have handled every hard thing that life has put in front of me with my head up and my eyes open. I am not fragile and I am not dramatic, and when I tell you that what happened to me on the Pennsylvanian 18 months ago made me call my daughter from the station platform and cry for the first time in 4 years, I need you to understand what that means coming from me. The Pennsylvanian runs from New York Penn Station through Philadelphia and on to Pittsburgh, with stops including Harrisburg, where I live. I use it a few times a year to get to Philadelphia for work, a trip I've made so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. Easy ride, just under 2 hours from Harrisburg to Philly. I know the train. I know the stations. I know exactly how it's supposed to feel. This was a Friday evening train, which is always busier than weekday trains because of weekend travelers. The car I boarded was about 3/4 full, which felt normal and even comfortable. There were families with luggage, young people heading into the city for the weekend, a few business travelers with laptops. Normal Friday evening train energy. I found a window seat about 1/3 of the way back. The aisle seat next to me was empty initially and stayed that way through the boarding process. By the time the doors closed and we pulled out of Harrisburg, the car had filled in everywhere except the seat beside me. Which was fine. I prefer the extra room. I was reading a book, not paying attention to anything around me, settled in for the ride. About 20 minutes outside of Harrisburg, somewhere in the rural stretch before Lancaster, a man sat down next to me. He had gotten on at one of the small rural stops, or come through from another car, I don't know which. What I know is that he sat down and immediately I felt something shift in the air. I looked up from my book. He was mid-30s, unremarkable looking, wearing a plain gray shirt. He sat down, put nothing in the overhead, had nothing in his hands, and looked at the seat back in front of him. I looked back at my book. Fine. People sit in empty seats. That is what empty seats are for. About 5 minutes later he spoke. He said, "You've got kind eyes." I looked at him. I said thank you in the short, closing way that you say it when you don't want to continue a conversation. He said, "I mean it as an observation, not a come on." I said nothing and looked back at my book. He said, "What are you reading?" I turned my book so the cover wasn't visible and said I'd rather just read if he didn't mind. He said okay. He was quiet for about 6 minutes, which I tracked on my phone because I wanted to know how long his version of quiet lasted. Then he said, "You take this train a lot." I put my book down. I looked at him directly and I asked him what he meant by that. He said he'd seen me on this train before. He said he was on this route often and he recognized me. He said I usually sat in the same general area of the car and that I usually read and that I sometimes fell asleep before Lancaster. He was describing a person he had observed across multiple train rides. He was describing me with a specificity that meant he had been watching me on this train, without my knowledge, more than once. I felt something go cold in my chest. Not just the content of what he was saying, but his tone. He said all of this with the calm of someone sharing pleasant small talk. Like telling a person you have cataloged their habits across multiple trips was a normal conversational offering. I did not respond to what he said. I took my phone out and sent a text to my daughter. I told her I was on the Pennsylvanian, car 4, window seat 12, and that a man sitting next to me was making me uncomfortable, and that if she didn't hear from me when I got to Philadelphia to call someone. She texted back in under a minute asking if I was okay. I told her I didn't know. The man was watching me text. He didn't pretend not to be. He just sat there and watched my hands on my phone and said nothing. I stood up. I said excuse me in a way that meant move or I will step on you, and he moved, and I took my bag from the overhead and walked to the front of the car. I found the conductor near the front door and told him quietly and specifically what was happening. He was a heavy-set man, named according to his badge as T. Elroy, and he listened without interrupting, and then walked back through the car with me at a distance. The man was still in the seat, now in the window seat where I had been, looking out the window. The conductor approached him, and I moved to a seat near a family 4 rows up. I couldn't hear the conversation. It lasted about 3 minutes. The conductor came back and told me the man had said he hadn't meant any harm and had agreed to move to a different car. I watched from my seat as he gathered himself, stood up, and walked through the rear door of the car. The conductor sat in the aisle seat across from me until Philadelphia. Again, the professional version of making sure someone is not alone without saying it explicitly. When I got to Philadelphia, I called my daughter from the platform and I cried. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the specific violation of learning that someone has been watching you on a train you thought was safe, over multiple trips, and you had no idea. Learning that your routine is someone else's entertainment. That you've been observed and cataloged and studied by someone you never noticed. I have taken that train twice since then. Both times I sat in a different part of the car, and I did not read. I watched the car the way you watch a room when you know something is wrong, without making it obvious that you're watching. I have not seen him again on those trips, but I have learned something I cannot unlearn, which is that not seeing someone who is watching you does not mean they are not there. It might just mean they're better at it than you expect. Story 3, Barrett, Savannah, Georgia. I'm 36. I'm a high school history teacher in Savannah, and every summer for the past 6 years, I've taken the Silver Meteor from Savannah up to New York City to visit my brother for 2 weeks. It's a long ride, about 14 hours, and I book a roomette in the sleeper car because 14 hours in a coach seat is not something I'm willing to do anymore. The roomette is small, 2 seats that fold into beds, a door that locks, a window. It's private and quiet, and I look forward to it every summer. It's become part of the trip itself, the ritual of it. Boarding in Savannah with my bag and my books, getting settled into my little room, watching the Georgia and Carolinas and Virginia landscape go by. Last summer, that ritual became something I will spend a long time processing. And I want to be very precise about the details because the details are what make this what it is. I boarded the Silver Meteor in Savannah on a Thursday afternoon in late June, just after 4 in the afternoon. The sleeper car attendant, a man named Roy who I'd actually had on previous trips, showed me to my roomette, which was the 3rd room from the end of the car. I got settled, the train left on time, and everything was normal through the Georgia evening. I had dinner in the dining car, came back to my room, converted the seat to the bed configuration, and was asleep by 9:30. 14-hour train rides incentivize early bedtimes. I woke up at some point in the night. Deep dark, the specific darkness of a moving train in rural country where there are no lights outside the window. I checked my phone. 2:47 in the morning. We were somewhere in Virginia, I calculated, maybe between Richmond and Alexandria. I was warm and the train was rocking and I was not fully awake. I lay there in the comfortable half-state of someone who has woken up in the night for no clear reason and is about to slide back into sleep. Then I heard someone try my door. Not knock, try. The specific sound of a door handle being depressed and then the resistance of a lock holding. One attempt, very quiet, almost gentle, the way you'd try a door if you were trying to determine whether it was locked without waking whoever was inside. I went completely still. I was suddenly completely awake. I lay there and listened. Silence, just the rhythm of the train. I told myself a confused passenger had tried the wrong door. It happens in sleeper cars, the doors all look identical, and if someone wakes up disoriented, they can try the wrong one. I lay there and tried to talk myself back to sleep for about 3 minutes. Then it happened again. Same sound. Same gentle, deliberate attempt. Same resistance from the lock. They were trying my door a second time. And the second time meant it was not a mistake. A confused passenger tries a wrong door once and then figures out their error. Twice is not confusion. I sat up as quietly as I could, and in the dark I looked at the door. My roomette doors have a privacy curtain on the window portion that I had closed before bed. The curtain was fully drawn. I could see nothing through it. I didn't know if someone was standing on the other side of that curtain looking in. I picked up my phone and called the sleeper car attendant line, which every roomette has a number for on the little instruction card they give you when you board. Roy picked up in 2 rings. I whispered to him that someone had tried my door twice in the last few minutes. He was immediately alert, no sleep in his voice, and said he would come down the corridor and check. He said to stay in my room with the door locked. I heard him come through the car a minute later, his footsteps distinct even over the train noise because he was moving with purpose. I heard him stop outside my door and say quietly that it was Roy. I asked him through the door if he saw anyone. He said the corridor was empty. He said he'd walked the full length of the sleeper car and checked the connector to the coach section, and there was no one in the corridor. I asked him if there was any way someone could have gotten into the sleeper car from the coach section. He was quiet for a moment. He said the door between cars required a staff key card after 10 at night, which he confirmed was secured. Sleeper car passengers only after 10. He asked me if I was certain about what I'd heard. I told him I was absolutely certain. 2 attempts. The same sound both times. He didn't push back on that. He said he was going to stay at the end of the corridor in the small attendant seat near the car entrance for the rest of the night. He asked me to call immediately if I heard anything else. I locked my door, sat up against the headboard with my phone in my hand, and did not sleep again for the rest of the ride. I watched the sky outside my window go from black to deep blue to gray to the pale early light of a Virginia morning, and around 6, I heard other passengers starting to move through the corridor, and the car beginning to come alive, and only then did I feel like I could breathe without measuring it. When I got off in New York, Roy was at the door of the sleeper car. He handed me off the train and then leaned slightly toward me and said, in a low voice, that he'd found something when he checked the car more thoroughly in the morning. He said there was a mark on my door, on the door frame specifically, low and to the right, like something small had been wedged between the door and the frame, the kind of mark that certain tools leave when someone is probing a door lock. He said he didn't want to alarm me the night before because he wasn't certain, but he thought I should know. Something had been at my door, with more than just a hand. I stood on that platform in Penn Station with my bag at my feet, and I looked at Roy and I thanked him. He nodded and said he was going to file a report with Amtrak and that I should do the same. I did. I don't know who was in that sleeper car that night. I don't know how they got there or how they left or whether the keycard door between sections actually held or whether it didn't and Roy told me it did to keep me calm. I don't know which roomette they came from or whether they were a passenger who had simply been planning something and waiting for the deep dark of a Virginia night to do it. What I know is that I had a locked door between me and whoever it was. And they were working on that. I'm going to New York again this summer to see my brother. I've booked a train. Different line, different route. I don't know yet if I'll sleep when the lights go out. I don't know if I'll lie there in the dark listening to the door the way I know I'm going to. What I do know is this. The door held, and I'm going to need to keep telling myself that until I believe it.